One day you stop replying. Not because you hate people, not because something dramatic happened, not because you're depressed. Group chats sit unread, invitations get seen, then quietly ignored. Calls go to voicemail, and you don't call back. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, like something is wrong. But something inside you changed, quietly, gradually, without a single obvious moment you could point to. And psychology says that change is far rarer and far more specific than most people assume. This isn't a story about isolation. It's a story about a particular kind of mind reaching a particular kind of threshold, one that has almost nothing to do with disliking people and almost everything to do with understanding yourself. Why people slowly disappear without realizing it. It rarely happens all at once. There's no single dramatic exit, no announcement, no clean break. It happens in small decisions, declining one more event, letting one more message sit unanswered for a day, then a week, choosing a quiet evening over a gathering you know you could technically enjoy. Each decision on its own seems insignificant, but psychologists who study behavioral patterns point out that identity shifts rarely announce themselves. They accumulate silently through repeated small choices, until one day the pattern itself becomes undeniable. By the time someone notices they've disappeared, they usually didn't choose to disappear on any single day. They simply stopped forcing themselves towards something that no longer felt necessary. This is a subtle but important distinction. It isn't collapse, it's redirection. Attention and energy quietly moving away from broad social contact and towards something else entirely. But to understand why this redirection happens, you have to understand what's shifting underneath it. Most people build their early social identity around a simple, unconscious rule. More connection equals more safety, more belonging, more
value. This rule makes sense early in life. Social bonds meant protection, resources, and status. Being known by many people once carried real survival value. But at a certain point, some people quietly encounter a different realization, one psychologists associate with increased self-awareness and identity consolidation. The realization that broad social contact and genuine connection are not the same thing. This is the hidden shift. Not a loss of interest in people, a loss of interest in performing social presence for its own sake. Once that distinction becomes clear, the old rule stops working. Attending an event simply to be seen no longer feels rewarding. Maintaining a wide circle simply to avoid being alone starts to feel quietly like effort spent without real return. This shift isn't dramatic from the outside, but internally it changes almost everything about how a person allocates their time and energy. And what replaces that old rule tends to surprise people who haven't experienced it themselves. Why fewer relationships often create more peace. Here's what rarely gets said clearly. Fewer relationships chosen deliberately often produce more emotional stability than many relationships maintained out of habit or obligation. This connects to a well-documented psychological concept called relational depth, the idea that the quality and authenticity of a connection matters more for well-being than the sheer number of connections maintained. Multiple studies on friendship and life satisfaction have found that people with a small number of close, meaningful relationships often report higher well-being than people with large, loosely connected social networks. This makes intuitive sense once examined closely. A wide social circle requires constant low-level maintenance, remembering context, managing expectations, performing enough social energy to stay included. A small number of deep relationships requires something different, presence rather
than performance. For people who've made this shift, disappearing from a broader social scene isn't a loss. It's often the direct result of redirecting limited energy toward fewer, more meaningful connections, and simply no longer having enough left over for the rest. But this raises an important question. If it's not about disliking people, what exactly is being conserved? Energy management versus loneliness. Here's a distinction that changes how this entire pattern should be understood. Withdrawing from broad social life is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is the painful gap between the connection someone wants and the connection they actually have. Solitude, by contrast, is often a deliberate, comfortable state, chosen, not suffered. Psychologists studying social behavior increasingly frame social interaction through the lens of energy management rather than simple preference. Every interaction, even pleasant ones, draws on a limited daily resource of attention, patience, and emotional bandwidth. For some people, that resource depletes quickly, not because they're weak, but because their nervous system processes social stimulation more intensely. This means the choice to withdraw from broader social contact is frequently a form of resource management, not a symptom of sadness. The person isn't running from people. They're protecting a finite supply of energy for the interactions that matter most. This distinction matters enormously because it's often misread by others as coldness or disinterest, when it's frequently the opposite, a deep enough respect for real connection that shallow versions of it no longer feel worth the cost. But there's a deeper psychological framework that explains exactly why this particular kind of exhaustion builds in the first place. Carl Jung's persona versus true self. Decades ago, the psychologist Carl Jung introduced a concept that still explains this pattern remarkably well: the difference between the persona and the
true self. The persona, in Jung's framework, is the social mask, the curated version of yourself presented to the world, shaped by what's expected, acceptable, and socially rewarded in a given context. The true self, by contrast, is the internal experience beneath that mask, private, unfiltered, and often quite different from the version shown publicly. Jung suggested that some degree of persona is necessary for functioning in society. The problem arises when someone spends so much time operating through the persona that the gap between it and the true self grows uncomfortably wide. For highly self-aware individuals, that gap becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Every social interaction that requires performing a version of themselves, rather than simply existing as themselves, starts to register as a small, cumulative cost. This is often what's actually happening when someone describes social events as draining, even when nothing unpleasant occurred. It isn't the people. It's the persistent effort of maintaining a persona that no longer feels aligned with who they actually are. Withdrawal, in this light, becomes less about avoiding others and more about reducing the frequency of wearing a mask that's grown uncomfortable to hold in place. But this shift toward authenticity doesn't happen randomly. It tends to correlate with a specific psychological trait. Why intelligent people value authenticity over popularity. Multiple studies examining personality and social behavior have found a consistent pattern. Individuals with higher self-awareness and stronger internal locus of control, meaning they base decisions on personal values rather than external approval, tend to prioritize authentic connection over broad social visibility. This isn't about intelligence in the traditional sense of raw cognitive ability. It's about a specific kind of psychological insight, the capacity to notice the difference between genuine engagement and social obligation, and
to act on that difference even when it's socially inconvenient. People with this trait often reach a point where maintaining popularity, in the traditional sense, feels less valuable than maintaining internal consistency, living in a way that matches their private values, rather than a way optimized for external approval. This creates an interesting tension. From the outside, stepping back from a wide social circle can look like decline or even arrogance. From the inside, it often feels like relief, finally spending less energy managing perception and more energy engaging with what genuinely matters. This is rarely a rejection of people altogether. It's a redirection toward a smaller number of relationships built on authenticity rather than social maintenance. But underneath all of this lies a purely physiological explanation, one rooted directly in the nervous system. Social interaction, even enjoyable interaction, activates significant neural activity. The brain must process facial expressions, tone, timing, and appropriate responses, largely in real time. Neuroscientists studying social cognition have identified this as a genuinely demanding cognitive task, drawing on regions associated with attention, memory, and emotional regulation simultaneously. This creates a measurable form of cognitive load, mental effort that accumulates the longer an interaction continues, regardless of how pleasant it feels in the moment. For individuals with heightened sensitivity to sensory and social input, this load builds faster and requires more recovery time afterward. This connects directly to nervous system regulation, the body's ongoing process of maintaining a stable internal state. Extended or frequent social exposure, for some people, pushes that internal state toward dysregulation, producing the familiar experience of feeling foggy, irritable, or emotionally flat after too much interaction. This is why solitude for certain individuals isn't avoidance.
It's regulation,
a necessary process of returning the nervous system to a baseline state after the genuine physiological cost of sustained social engagement. Understood this way, disappearing from frequent social contact isn't a character flaw. It's often simply an accurate response to a nervous system that requires more recovery time than the surrounding culture typically allows for. But there's an important line between this healthy form of withdrawal and something psychologically very different. Healthy solitude has a distinct psychological signature. It's chosen, not forced. It coexists with a small number of maintained, meaningful relationships, rather than replacing all connection entirely. People experiencing healthy solitude typically still feel emotionally regulated, curious, and engaged with life, simply directing that engagement inward or toward a smaller circle, rather than outward toward broad social contact. Crucially, healthy solitude doesn't involve significant emotional pain about the absence of connection. It involves relief, clarity, and often increased creative or reflective capacity, precisely because unnecessary social obligation has been removed. This state tends to feel expansive rather than restrictive, more mental space, not less life. Recognizing this pattern in yourself, when it's genuinely present, isn't something to be corrected. It's something to be understood, and in many cases, respected as a legitimate psychological need rather than an inconvenience to overcome. But this same pattern, under different conditions, can shift into something that deserves a much closer look. Not every version of withdrawal is healthy, and the distinction matters. When disappearing from social life is accompanied by persistent low mood, a loss of interest in previously meaningful activities, or a growing sense of emotional numbness rather than clarity, it may reflect something psychologically different, potentially linked to depression or
unresolved emotional distress, rather than a deliberate, energy-conscious choice. A useful internal question is this: does solitude currently feel peaceful, or does it feel like a wall you can't seem to climb over, even when part of you wants to? Healthy withdrawal generally still allows for occasional, chosen connection without dread. Unhealthy withdrawal often comes with a quiet sense of being trapped, even when alone. If someone notices persistent emptiness, hopelessness, or a complete absence of desire for any connection at all, that pattern is worth taking seriously and worth discussing with a mental health professional, rather than interpreting it solely through the lens of introversion or authenticity. The difference isn't always obvious from the outside, but internally, it's usually unmistakable. The difference between chosen quiet and quiet that has quietly become a cage. Disappearing from a wide social life was never really about the people left behind. It was about a mind that finally understood the difference between being seen and being known, between managing a persona and living as something closer to the truth. Some people spend their entire lives chasing a wider circle, mistaking visibility for connection. Others eventually stop chasing altogether and discover quietly that a smaller life lived honestly can hold more meaning than a crowded one ever did. If any part of this described something you felt but never had the words for, you might find the next video says something you've been waiting to hear too.